Margaret Chun moved through the pristine kitchen of their Beacon Hill mansion with practiced silence, her slippered feet making no sound against the imported Italian marble. Steam rose from the silver coffee service as she arranged delicate porcelain cups on the mahogany tray, each piece positioned with the precision of someone who had learned long ago that perfection was expected, not praised. The morning light streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows caught the modest diamond on her wedding ring, a simple band that Richard had chosen 15 years ago when his accounting firm was still struggling to pay rent. Now, as voices drifted from his home office where he conducted his weekly business meetings, Margaret could hear the confident boom of success that had replaced his once humble tone. She lifted the heavy tray, her small frame belying surprising strength, and walked toward the mahogany doors that separated her world from his. Through the gap, she glimpsed Richard Blackwood in his element, gesturing expansively to three men in expensive suits while charts and documents covered his massive desk. Margaret knocked softly twice before entering, keeping her eyes downcast as she had trained herself to do. The conversation barely paused as she set the tray on the sideboard and began serving coffee with the invisible efficiency of practiced domestic service. Richard barely glanced in her direction as he continued his presentation. The quarterly projections show unprecedented growth in our commercial real estate portfolio, gentlemen. We've tripled our market share in just 18 months. James Morrison, Richard's longtime business partner, accepted his coffee cup with a nod that acknowledged Margaret's existence for exactly half a second. The expansion into the financial district has been particularly lucrative. Your vision for acquiring those properties was brilliant, Richard. Margaret handed the third cup to David Sullivan, the silver-haired investor who had backed several of Richard's ventures. As she turned back toward the tray, Richard's voice cut through the room with casual dismissiveness. Oh, gentlemen, I don't believe you've properly met my wife, Margaret. She keeps the home running smoothly while we handle the real business. Three sets of eyes turned toward Margaret with the polite but distant attention reserved for household staff. She smiled softly, her hands clasped in front of her simple navy dress, and inclined her head in greeting. How lovely to meet you properly, Mrs. Blackwood, Sullivan said with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to acknowledging wives at business functions. Richard speaks so highly of your domestic skills. Margaret's smile remained steady as she absorbed the subtle insult wrapped in pleasantry. She had learned years ago that responding to such comments only invited more condescension. Instead, she simply nodded and retreated to her position by the sideboard. Margaret handles all the household management, Richard continued, his tone carrying the satisfied air of a man cataloging his possessions. Meal planning, social scheduling, that sort of thing. Leaves me free to focus on building our empire. The word "our" hung in the air for just a moment, and Margaret's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the silver serving spoon she was polishing. None of the men noticed the slight tension in her shoulders or the way her dark eyes flickered with something that might have been amusement. Morrison leaned back in his leather chair, coffee cup balanced perfectly in his manicured hand. It's wonderful when a man can focus entirely on business without domestic distractions. My own wife understands the value of supporting her husband's vision. Before Margaret could respond, the soft chime of the doorbell echoed through the house. Richard's expression shifted immediately, anticipatory brightness replacing his businesslike demeanor. "Ah, that will be Victoria Sterling, our real estate consultant," Richard announced, rising from his chair with an energy that hadn't been present moments before. "She's been instrumental in our recent acquisitions. Brilliant woman, absolutely brilliant." Margaret moved toward the hallway to answer the door, but Richard was already striding past her, his hand briefly touching her shoulder in a gesture that somehow managed to be both possessive and dismissive. "No need, Margaret. I'll get it. Victoria and I have some urgent market analysis to discuss." As Richard's footsteps echoed down the marble hallway, the three businessmen exchanged knowing glances. Margaret continued polishing the silver, her expression serene, but her hearing sharply attuned to the voices approaching from the foyer. Richard's laughter reached the office first, rich and warm in a way that Margaret hadn't heard directed at her in months. When he returned, he was accompanied by a woman whose presence immediately shifted the energy of the room. Victoria Sterling commanded attention without effort. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a sleek chignon that emphasized her sharp cheekbones and confident green eyes. Her charcoal suit was clearly custom-tailored, and she moved with the purposeful grace of someone who had never doubted her welcome in any room. "Gentlemen, may I present Victoria Sterling of Sterling Luxury Properties," Richard announced, his pride evident as he guided Victoria toward the men who were already rising to greet her. Margaret watched from her position by the sideboard as handshakes were exchanged and business cards appeared like magic. Victoria's smile was practiced perfection, but there was genuine intelligence behind her eyes that Margaret recognized and quietly respected. Victoria has an MBA from Wharton and 15 years of experience in high-end commercial properties, Richard continued, his introduction of Victoria notably longer and more detailed than his dismissal of Margaret minutes earlier. "She's been consulting on our financial district expansion." "The pleasure is mine," Victoria said, her voice carrying the confident cadence of someone accustomed to being the smartest person in the room. Richard has shown remarkable vision in identifying undervalued properties with exceptional potential. As the conversation shifted into technical discussions of market trends and investment strategies, Margaret became truly invisible. She refilled coffee cups, removed empty plates, and tidied papers with the efficiency of someone who had mastered the art of useful invisibility. Victoria's knowledge was impressive, Margaret had to admit. She spoke fluently about zoning regulations, municipal development plans, and tax incentive structures with the authority of genuine expertise. But there was something else in the way she looked at Richard, something that made Margaret's practiced composure require more effort to maintain. "I have to say," Margaret thought to herself as she watched Victoria laugh at one of Richard's jokes, "Victoria Sterling clearly knows her business. She also clearly knows exactly what she wants." The conversation continued for another hour, with Victoria seamlessly integrating herself into the group dynamic while Margaret remained a silent presence. When Victoria finally gathered her materials to leave, Richard insisted on walking her to the door personally. Margaret continued clearing the coffee service, but her attention was focused on the voices drifting from the hallway. Richard's tone with Victoria carried an intimacy that made Margaret's chest tighten with something that wasn't quite surprise. When Richard returned to the office, his business partners were already preparing to leave. The meeting had accomplished its purpose, and the men exchanged hearty handshakes and promises to finalize contracts by week's end. After the last guest departed, Margaret found herself alone in the office with Richard. He was reviewing documents at his desk, his attention completely absorbed by spreadsheets and projections. She began collecting the remaining coffee cups, her movements deliberate and quiet. Without looking up from his papers, Richard spoke in the casual tone of someone discussing the weather. "Victoria really is exceptional, isn't she? It's refreshing to work with someone who truly understands complex financial strategies." Margaret paused in her cleaning, a delicate china cup balanced in her hands. "She is certainly knowledgeable." Richard finally looked up, his expression carrying a mixture of impatience and condescension that had become increasingly common in recent months. "You wouldn't really understand the intricacies of commercial real estate, Margaret. It requires a certain level of sophisticated financial education." The words hung between them like a challenge, but Margaret's response was measured and soft. "Of course, Richard. I'm sure you and Victoria make an excellent team." Something in her tone made Richard study her face more carefully, but Margaret's expression remained perfectly composed. She finished clearing the coffee service and moved toward the door, her steps as silent as when she had entered. Just before she reached the threshold, Margaret paused and turned back toward her husband. The afternoon light from the windows caught her profile, highlighting features that spoke of intelligence and breeding that Richard had long ceased to notice. "Richard," she said quietly, her voice carrying a quality that made him look up from his papers. "When you speak with Victoria about future investments, you might want to be very careful about the properties you choose to pursue." Richard's eyebrows rose in surprise at the unexpected comment. "What do you mean by that?" Margaret's smile was gentle, almost maternal. "Just that some properties might have more complicated ownership structures than they appear on the surface. I would hate for you to encounter any unexpected legal complications." Before Richard could respond, Margaret had disappeared into the hallway, leaving behind only the faint scent of her lavender perfume and the echo of words that would later prove to be far more significant than either of them realized in that moment. Have you ever witnessed someone being completely underestimated because of their circumstances or background? Share in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you've seen people dismissed based on appearances rather than their actual capabilities. As evening settled over Beacon Hill, Margaret stood in her private study, a small room that Richard rarely entered because he considered it her feminine sanctuary, filled with books and family photographs. The walls were lined with volumes in multiple languages, and the desk held correspondence in elegant script that arrived regularly from Hong Kong. Margaret opened a wooden box that sat prominently on her bookshelf, removing a photograph that showed her standing beside an elderly Chinese man in an expensive suit. Behind them, the Hong Kong skyline glittered like scattered diamonds, and the nameplate on the building behind them read Chen International Holdings in both English and Chinese characters. She traced her finger along the glass that protected the image, her expression thoughtful as she considered the conversation that had taken place in Richard's office. Victoria Sterling was indeed brilliant, but brilliance combined with ambition and a flexible moral compass could become dangerous when directed at the wrong target. Margaret returned the photograph to its place and moved to her desk, where she opened a laptop that looked deceptively simple but was connected to financial networks that spanned 3 continents. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with practiced efficiency as she accessed accounts and documents that would have shocked her husband had he possessed the sophistication to understand their significance. The screen displayed numbers that would have dwarfed Richard's proudest quarterly projections, but Margaret's expression remained calm as she reviewed holdings and investments that had been carefully managed for decades. She had been born into wealth that Richard couldn't imagine and had been trained from childhood in business principles that made his recent successes look like practice exercises. As she worked, Margaret considered the choices that lay ahead. She had spent 15 years playing the role of supportive wife, watching Richard build his confidence and his business on foundations that were far less solid than he believed. She had funded his early ventures through carefully disguised loans and had guided his investments through seemingly casual suggestions that he had eventually claimed as his own insights. The time for gentle guidance and invisible support was drawing to a close. Richard's growing arrogance and his obvious infatuation with Victoria Sterling represented a line that Margaret had hoped never to cross. But some betrayals demanded consequences, and some lessons could only be taught through direct experience. Margaret closed the laptop and returned it to its locked drawer. Tomorrow, she would begin making phone calls that would set events in motion. Tonight, she would simply be the quiet housewife that Richard believed her to be, invisible and harmless in her domestic sanctuary. The irony was not lost on her that Richard's greatest mistake was not his affair with Victoria Sterling, but his fundamental misunderstanding of exactly who he had chosen to betray. Margaret Chen had been raised by a father who had built a shipping empire through patience, strategic thinking, and the ability to appear harmless until the moment when power needed to be exercised. She had learned those lessons well, and Richard Blackwood was about to discover that underestimating your opponent was a luxury that only the truly powerless could afford. 3 weeks after Victoria Sterling's first visit to the Blackwood mansion, Margaret discovered the truth in the most mundane way possible. She had been looking for Richard's business calendar to schedule a charity luncheon when she noticed his laptop was still open on his desk, the screen glowing softly in the dim light of his home office. The email thread was displayed prominently, and Margaret's trained eye caught the intimate tone immediately. Victoria's messages were peppered with personal endearments that had nothing to do with commercial real estate, and Richard's responses carried a warmth and attention that he hadn't directed toward his wife in months. Margaret scrolled through the correspondence with the methodical thoroughness of someone who understood the importance of gathering complete information. The affair had clearly been progressing for weeks, with detailed discussions of hotel meetings, carefully coordinated schedules, and promises that made Margaret's chest tighten with a mixture of betrayal and something that felt remarkably like relief. The most recent exchange was particularly illuminating. Victoria had sent photographs of luxury condominiums with suggestions about which one would be perfect for Richard's new life, while Richard had responded with assurances that the divorce would be swift and financially favorable to his new circumstances. Margaret heard Richard's car in the driveway, and quickly returned the laptop to its original position. When he entered the house, she was in the kitchen preparing dinner, her movements calm and unhurried despite the storm of information now occupying her thoughts. Richard joined her in the kitchen, loosening his tie with the satisfied air of a man who believed his secrets were safe. The Morrison contract went through perfectly. We'll be closing on the financial district properties next week. Margaret continued chopping vegetables. Her knife worked precise and steady. That's wonderful, Richard. Victoria must be pleased with how smoothly everything is progressing. Something in Margaret's tone made Richard glance at her more sharply, but her expression remained focused on her cooking. Victoria has been instrumental in making sure all the details align properly. The conversation continued through dinner with careful pleasantries that masked the tension building beneath the surface. Margaret had learned years ago to control her reactions, but the casual way Richard discussed his future plans while sitting across from the wife he intended to discard required every ounce of her considerable self-discipline. After dinner, as Richard retreated to his office for what he claimed was urgent business correspondence, Margaret made her decision. She had spent 15 years avoiding direct confrontation, but some situations demanded clarity, no matter how painful the process might prove to be. She knocked softly on Richard's office door and entered when he granted permission. He was typing furiously on his laptop, presumably continuing his intimate correspondence with Victoria, and barely looked up when Margaret approached his desk. "Richard," Margaret said quietly, her voice carrying a new quality that made him pause in his typing. "We need to discuss something important." Richard's expression shifted to the barely concealed impatience that had become his default response to Margaret's interruptions. "Can it wait, Margaret? I'm handling some urgent business matters that require my full attention." Margaret moved closer to his desk, her small hands clasped in front of her as she had trained herself to do when requesting her husband's attention. "I'm afraid it really can't wait, Richard. I know about Victoria Sterling." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge, and Richard's fingers froze above his keyboard. His expression shifted through several emotions before settling into something that looked remarkably like defiance rather than shame. "No, what about Victoria?" Richard asked, his tone carefully neutral in the way that confirmed Margaret's suspicions more clearly than any confession could have done. Margaret's voice remained steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I know that your relationship with her extends well beyond professional consulting. I know that you've been planning a future together that doesn't include me." Richard closed his laptop with deliberate slowness and leaned back in his chair, studying Margaret's face as if seeing her clearly for the first time in months. His expression shifted from defensive to something approaching relief, as if the burden of maintaining his deception had become more exhausting than he had anticipated. "You've been reading my private correspondence," Richard said, but his tone carried accusation rather than guilt. Margaret nodded slightly. "I have, and I've learned quite a lot about your plans and your feelings about our marriage." Richard stood from his chair and moved around his desk, positioning himself closer to Margaret in a gesture that might have seemed intimate but felt more like intimidation. His voice carried a new edge of honesty that was somehow more cruel than his previous deceptions. "Since you already know, Margaret, I suppose there's no point in pretending anymore. Yes, I'm involved with Victoria Sterling. Yes, we've been discussing our future together. And yes, that future doesn't include you." The words were delivered with a clinical detachment that made them more devastating than anger could have accomplished. Margaret absorbed the confirmation of her fears with the stoic composure that had been trained into her since childhood, but something in her eyes shifted in a way that Richard was too focused on his own liberation to notice. "Victoria understands me in ways that you never have," Richard continued, his voice gaining momentum as he embraced the opportunity to voice grievances he had been accumulating for months. "She appreciates my business acumen and my vision for the future. She doesn't need to be protected from complex financial discussions or business decisions." Margaret listened without interruption, her expression unchanged even as each word was designed to diminish her worth and justify Richard's betrayal. When he finally paused in his catalog of her inadequacies, she spoke with quiet dignity. "I see. And what exactly do you intend to do about our marriage, Richard?" Richard's smile carried a satisfaction that revealed how long he had been anticipating this conversation. "We'll file for divorce immediately. My lawyers have already prepared the preliminary paperwork. You'll receive a fair settlement, of course, but nothing that would compromise the business assets that I've worked so hard to build." Before Margaret could respond, the soft chime of the doorbell interrupted the confrontation. Richard's expression brightened immediately, and he moved toward the hallway with the eager energy of a man anticipating a pleasant surprise. "That will be Victoria," Richard announced over his shoulder. "We had planned to discuss some property acquisitions this evening, but I suppose the timing is actually perfect." Margaret remained in the office as Richard's footsteps echoed down the marble hallway. She could hear voices in the foyer, Richard's warm welcome mixing with Victoria's confident tones, and the sound of their approach back toward the office. When Richard returned with Victoria at his side, the dynamic in the room shifted dramatically. Victoria entered with the assured grace of someone who knew she was welcome, her designer coat draped over her arm and her expression carrying a mixture of professional confidence and personal satisfaction. "Victoria," Richard said, his voice warm with affection and something approaching pride, "I've just been discussing our situation with Margaret. I think it's time for complete honesty about where things stand." Victoria's green eyes assessed Margaret with the calculating precision of someone evaluating potential opposition. Her smile was perfectly polite, but carried an edge of triumph that she didn't bother to completely conceal. "Margaret," Victoria said, extending her hand in a gesture that managed to be both cordial and condescending, "I'm so glad we can finally speak openly. Richard has told me so much about you." Margaret accepted the handshake with her characteristic quiet dignity, but her eyes remained fixed on Victoria's face with an intensity that made the other woman's confident smile waver slightly. "I'm sure he has," Margaret replied softly, "and I'm equally sure that your professional expertise has been invaluable to Richard's recent business success." Victoria's laugh was carefully modulated to sound both modest and self-assured. "Richard and I do work very well together. We seem to understand each other's goals and methods in a way that creates natural synergy." The words were chosen with surgical precision, each one designed to emphasize the connection between Richard and Victoria while highlighting Margaret's exclusion from their world of sophisticated business dealings. Richard moved to stand beside Victoria, his hand briefly touching her elbow in a gesture of support that he hadn't offered to Margaret during the entire confrontation. "Margaret, Victoria and I have been discussing the future extensively. We believe that honesty about our relationship is the best foundation for moving forward." Margaret nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful rather than devastated. "And what exactly does moving forward look like from your perspective?" Victoria and Richard exchanged a glance that spoke of conversations Margaret had not been privy to and decisions that had been made without her input. Victoria answered with the confident authority of someone who believed the outcome was already determined. "Richard and I plan to formalize our relationship once his divorce is finalized," Victoria said, her tone carrying the satisfied certainty of someone who had never doubted her ability to achieve her goals. "We've already begun looking at properties that would be suitable for our shared future." Margaret's smile was slight but genuine, as if Victoria had confirmed something important rather than delivered a devastating blow. "How thorough of you both. And I suppose you've given considerable thought to the financial arrangements that would make such a future possible." Richard's expression carried a mixture of impatience and condescension that had become his standard response to Margaret's questions about business matters. "Margaret, you don't need to concern yourself with the complex financial aspects of this situation. My lawyers will ensure that you receive an appropriate settlement that reflects your contributions to our household." The phrase "your contributions to our household" hung in the air with particular emphasis, as if Richard's acknowledgement of Margaret's domestic service was a generous concession rather than a bare minimum recognition of 15 years of support. Victoria nodded in agreement, her expression carrying the sympathetic concern of someone discussing arrangements for a beloved but aging pet. "Richard has been very generous in structuring a settlement that will allow you to maintain a comfortable lifestyle, Margaret. A nice condominium somewhere quiet, perhaps in the suburbs, would give you the fresh start that everyone deserves." Margaret listened to their careful explanations of her future displacement with the serene attention of someone hearing weather predictions for a distant city. When they finished outlining their vision of her diminished circumstances, she spoke with quiet curiosity. And you're both confident that the business assets and properties will transfer smoothly to support this new arrangement. Richard's laugh carried the satisfied confidence of a man who believed he had outgrown his origins and earned his current success through pure merit. Margaret, I've built everything we have through my own vision and hard work. The business relationships, the property investments, the financial growth, all of that comes from my expertise and my ability to recognize opportunities that others miss. Victoria nodded enthusiastically, her admiration for Richard's supposed business genius evident in her expression. Richard's success in the commercial real estate market has been absolutely remarkable. His ability to identify undervalued properties and structure profitable deals is exactly the kind of vision that creates lasting wealth. Margaret's response was barely audible, but something in her tone made both Richard and Victoria pause in their celebration of his achievements. Undervalued properties, Margaret repeated softly, as if testing the phrase for accuracy. How interesting that you've found such success in that particular area, Richard. Before either Richard or Victoria could respond to the subtle strangeness in Margaret's comment, she continued in the same thoughtful tone. I wonder if you've given any consideration to the possibility that some of those properties might have more complex ownership histories than their current documentation suggests. Richard's expression shifted to confused irritation at Margaret's unexpected venture into business discussion. Margaret, you really don't understand how property acquisition works. Victoria and I have done extensive research into every investment. We're not amateur investors who would overlook important details. Victoria's agreement was immediate and emphatic. We always conduct thorough due diligence, Margaret. Title searches, ownership verification, lien analysis. Everything is examined carefully before any commitments are made. Margaret nodded slowly, as if their explanations had satisfied some private concern. Of course, I'm sure your research has been very thorough within the scope of publicly available documentation. The qualification in her statement, within the scope of publicly available documentation, created a subtle tension that neither Richard nor Victoria fully understood, but both found vaguely unsettling. Margaret rose from her chair with the graceful composure that had carried her through 15 years of marriage to a man who had never truly seen her. Richard, Victoria, I appreciate your honesty about your relationship and your plans for the future. It's certainly helpful to understand exactly where everyone stands. Richard's relief at Margaret's apparent acceptance of the situation was evident in his voice. I'm glad you're taking this so well, Margaret. I know this is a difficult transition, but I believe everyone will be happier once we're all able to move forward honestly. Victoria's smile carried genuine warmth for the first time during the conversation, as if Margaret's gracious defeat had earned her a measure of respect. You're handling this with remarkable dignity, Margaret. I hope we can all maintain a cordial relationship as we work through the practical details. Margaret's response was delivered with such gentle sincerity that neither Richard nor Victoria noticed the steel beneath her words. I'm sure we can, Victoria. After all, some transitions take longer to complete than others, and it's important to be patient with processes that involve complicated histories. As Margaret moved toward the office door, she paused and turned back toward Richard and Victoria with the expression of someone who had just remembered an important detail. Richard, she said softly, when you speak with your lawyers about the divorce arrangements, you might want to ask them to research the original funding sources for your business ventures very carefully. Sometimes historical financial documentation can reveal complications that weren't apparent at the time of initial investment. Before either Richard or Victoria could respond, Margaret had disappeared into the hallway, leaving them alone with the echo of words that would prove to be far more significant than their confident dismissal suggested. Victoria turned to Richard with a slightly puzzled expression. What did she mean about funding sources and historical documentation? Richard's laugh carried the dismissive certainty of a man who had never doubted his own narrative of self-made success. Margaret has always had a tendency to overcomplicate simple situations, Victoria. She doesn't really understand business finance, so she creates mysteries where none exist. My lawyers have handled every aspect of my business formation. There are no complications. Victoria nodded, her confidence restored by Richard's assured explanation. Of course. I suppose she's just trying to process a difficult situation and looking for ways to feel more involved in decisions that are beyond her understanding. As Richard and Victoria settled into discussing their future plans with renewed enthusiasm, Margaret stood in her private study, holding a small address book filled with numbers that connected her to legal firms in Hong Kong, New York, and London. Her expression was calm as she considered which conversations would need to happen first and in what sequence to achieve the most devastating effect. Richard's greatest mistake was not his affair with Victoria Sterling, though that betrayal certainly provided the moral justification for what was about to unfold. His true error was 15 years of willful blindness about exactly who had been funding his business success and what legal structures had been quietly put in place to protect those investments. Margaret opened her laptop and began composing emails in multiple languages to people who had been waiting patiently for her instructions. The time for gentle guidance and invisible support was over. Tomorrow, Richard and Victoria would begin learning the difference between confidence based on ignorance and power based on comprehensive preparation. Some lessons, Margaret reflected as she worked, could only be taught through direct and undeniable experience. At 7:30 the following morning, Margaret stood in her private study with a secure phone pressed to her ear, speaking in rapid Mandarin to someone 8,000 miles away in Hong Kong. The conversation was brief but comprehensive, covering legal strategies that had been prepared years earlier but never implemented. "Uncle William," Margaret said, using the respectful term for her father's longtime business partner and legal advisor, "the time has come to activate the protective measures we discussed when I married Richard. He has chosen to end our marriage in favor of someone who believes she understands his financial position." The voice on the other end carried the authority of someone who had spent decades managing complex international business affairs. "Margaret, are you certain this is the path you wish to take? Once these mechanisms are set in motion, the consequences will be permanent and comprehensive." Margaret's gaze moved to the photograph on her desk showing her with her father, Jonathan Chun, in front of the Chun International Holdings building. Her voice carried the quiet certainty of someone who had been raised to understand both power and responsibility. "I am certain, Uncle William. Richard has made his choice with complete awareness of the pain it would cause. Victoria Sterling has researched what she believes to be his assets with the intention of sharing in their benefits. They both deserve to understand exactly what they have chosen to pursue." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Margaret providing specific details about Richard's business ventures and Victoria's involvement in his recent property acquisitions. When she finally ended the call, Margaret felt the familiar calm that came from setting carefully planned strategies into motion. She opened the wooden box on her bookshelf and removed several photographs that told the story Richard had never bothered to learn. The images showed Margaret at various stages of her education and early career, standing beside business leaders and academic institutions that represented a world of sophistication and power that Richard couldn't imagine. In one photograph, a 22-year-old Margaret stood with her graduating class at the London School of Economics, her summa cum laude honors clearly visible on the diploma in her hands. Another showed her at 25, shaking hands with the Chancellor of Hong Kong University after delivering a guest lecture on international finance. But it was the oldest photograph that held the most significance. Margaret at 18, standing beside her father in the boardroom of Chun International Holdings, surrounded by shipping charts and cargo manifests that represented one of Asia's most successful logistics empires. Margaret had been groomed from childhood to eventually take control of the family business, with an education that included advanced degrees in international law and corporate finance. Her decision to marry Richard Blackwood and live quietly in Boston had been presented to her family as a temporary cultural exploration, a chance to understand American business practices from the ground up. What her family had not anticipated was that Margaret would find genuine affection for Richard during his early years of struggle, when his accounting practice was small and his ambitions seemed modest. She had supported his growth not from naivety, but from a deliberate choice to help someone she cared about achieve his potential. The family lawyers had insisted on protective structures from the beginning, but Margaret had believed they would never be necessary. Richard's transformation from grateful partner to entitled beneficiary had been gradual, so gradual that Margaret had continued hoping he would remember the foundation of their relationship. His affair with Victoria Sterling and his casual dismissal of Margaret's contributions represented a line that could not be uncrossed. More importantly, His assumption that he could simply discard her and claim ownership of assets he had never truly controlled demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding that required correction. Margaret returned the photographs to their box and moved to her computer, where she began reviewing documents that outlined the true ownership structure of every property and business venture that Richard considered his personal success story. The Beacon Hill mansion had been purchased entirely with funds from a Chin family trust, with Richard listed as a beneficiary rather than an owner. His business expansion had been funded through a series of carefully structured loans from Hong Kong-based financial institutions, all of which were ultimately controlled by Chun International Holdings. Even Richard's most recent and proudest achievement, the financial district property acquisitions that Victoria had helped him identify, had been financed through shell companies that were ultimately owned by Margaret personally through inheritance structures that predated her marriage. Richard's business success was entirely real, but the foundation upon which it rested belonged to Margaret in ways that no divorce settlement could alter. She had allowed him to believe in his own self-made narrative because supporting his confidence had seemed kind. His betrayal had eliminated her motivation for such kindness. Margaret's phone rang, and she answered to find Victoria Sterling's voice on the other end, professionally polite, but carrying an undertone of territorial satisfaction. "Margaret, I hope you don't mind my calling directly, but Richard and I have been discussing the timeline for transitioning some of the household arrangements, and I wanted to coordinate with you to make the process as smooth as possible." Margaret's response was gracious and cooperative. "Of course, Victoria. I appreciate your consideration in reaching out personally." Victoria's tone carried the confident authority of someone who believed she was negotiating from a position of strength. "We were thinking that perhaps you might want to begin looking at alternative living arrangements sooner rather than later. I have some contacts in suburban real estate who specialize in comfortable condominiums for women in transitional situations." The phrase "women in transitional situations" was delivered with such careful sympathy that it took Margaret a moment to recognize the calculated insult wrapped within the apparent kindness. "That's very thoughtful, Victoria," Margaret replied, her tone remaining perfectly pleasant. "Have you and Richard given consideration to how quickly you'd like to formalize your own living arrangements?" Victoria's satisfaction was audible in her voice. "Actually, yes. We've been looking at some beautiful properties that would be perfect for our shared future. Richard's business success has opened up some wonderful possibilities." Margaret made appropriate sounds of interest while Victoria described luxury condominiums and suburban estates that she and Richard had apparently been researching with the enthusiasm of people planning a well-funded future. "Richard has such excellent taste in investments," Victoria continued. "His ability to identify properties with potential for appreciation is really remarkable. I've learned so much from observing his decision-making process." Margaret's agreement was sincere, though not for the reasons Victoria assumed. "Richard does have a talent for recognizing valuable opportunities. I'm sure your combined expertise will lead to excellent choices." After ending the call with Victoria, Margaret spent the morning making additional phone calls to legal firms and financial institutions across 3 time zones. Each conversation was brief and focused, activating systems that had been prepared but never implemented. By noon, Margaret had set in motion a series of events that would systematically reveal the true ownership structure of every asset that Richard believed he controlled. The process would unfold over the next several days with the inexorable precision of a perfectly designed legal mechanism. Margaret's approach was not driven by vindictive anger, but by the methodical thoroughness that her father had taught her was essential when dealing with people who mistook kindness for weakness. Richard and Victoria deserved to understand exactly what they had chosen to pursue, and Margaret intended to provide that education with comprehensive clarity. At 2 o'clock, Margaret received a call from her primary attorney in Hong Kong, confirming that the preliminary legal notices had been prepared and would be delivered to Richard's business address the following morning. The documents would be the first indication that his assumptions about asset ownership were fundamentally incorrect. Margaret spent the afternoon reviewing financial records that documented her family's support for Richard's business ventures over the past 15 years. The pattern was clear and comprehensive, showing a systematic investment in Richard's success that had been disguised as business loans and structured partnerships. The most significant revelation would be the ownership structure of Richard's crown jewel investment, the financial district properties that Victoria had helped him acquire. The funding for those purchases had come entirely from Margaret's personal inheritance, channeled through legal structures that gave Richard management authority but not ownership rights. Victoria Sterling's expertise in commercial real estate was genuine and impressive, but her due diligence had been limited to publicly available documentation. The true ownership history of the properties she had researched was buried in international corporate structures that required specialized legal knowledge to uncover. As evening approached, Margaret prepared dinner with the same calm efficiency that had characterized her behavior throughout their marriage, but her mind was focused on the conversations that would take place over the next few days. Richard and Victoria were about to discover that confidence based on incomplete information was a luxury that only the genuinely powerless could afford. Margaret had spent 15 years allowing Richard to believe in his own narrative of self-made success, but his betrayal had eliminated her motivation for protecting his illusions. Some lessons about power and ownership could only be taught through direct experience of their consequences. When Richard arrived home that evening, he was accompanied by Victoria, who had apparently become a regular presence at what she believed would soon be her new home. They entered the kitchen together with the comfortable familiarity of people who had moved beyond secrecy into open partnership. "Margaret," Richard announced with satisfaction, "Victoria and I have made some excellent progress on our future planning today. We've identified several properties that would be perfect for our next phase." Victoria's enthusiasm was evident as she described luxury condominiums with views of Boston Harbor and suburban estates with enough space for entertaining Richard's business associates. Her research had clearly been thorough within the limitations of publicly available information. Margaret listened with genuine interest to their detailed plans, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated her understanding of real estate markets and investment strategies. Both Richard and Victoria seemed surprised by the depth of her knowledge, but they attributed it to casual absorption rather than formal education. "You seem to understand these concepts better than I expected," Victoria commented with approving surprise. "Perhaps you have more business aptitude than Richard realized." Margaret's smile was gentle and self-deprecating. "I've always been interested in learning about Richard's work, even if I haven't had the formal education to contribute meaningfully to his decisions." Richard's response carried the patronizing affection of someone explaining complex concepts to an intelligent child. "Margaret has always been a good listener, Victoria. She picks up bits and pieces from our dinner conversations, but she doesn't really grasp the underlying financial structures that make these investments possible." The conversation continued through dinner, with Margaret playing her familiar role of supportive wife, while Richard and Victoria discussed their future with increasing detail and confidence. Neither of them noticed the way Margaret's questions gradually focused on specific aspects of ownership verification and legal documentation. After dinner, as Richard and Victoria retreated to his office to review property listings and financial projections, Margaret returned to her study to finalize the preparations that would transform their confident planning into a comprehensive education about the difference between apparent control and actual ownership. Tomorrow, Richard would begin receiving documents that would systematically dismantle his understanding of his own financial position. Victoria would discover that her expertise in commercial real estate had missed the most important factor in property valuation, which was knowing who actually owned what she thought she was helping to acquire. Margaret's father had taught her that the most important business skill was the ability to maintain strategic patience while inferior competitors eliminated themselves through overconfidence and inadequate preparation. Richard and Victoria were about to provide a textbook demonstration of that principle. Some lessons about power could only be learned through experiencing its systematic and undeniable application. Margaret intended to provide that education with the thoroughness that both Richard and Victoria deserved, given the confidence with which they had planned her displacement. The Chun family had not built an international business empire by allowing competitors to mistake generosity for weakness. Richard was about to learn that 15 years of marriage to Margaret Chun had not given him ownership of anything except the consequences of his own choices. As Margaret prepared for bed in the guest room where she had been sleeping since discovering Richard's affair, she felt the calm satisfaction that came from knowing that tomorrow would begin the systematic revelation of exactly how much Richard had misunderstood about the foundation of his success. Victoria Sterling would also learn that expertise in commercial real estate meant nothing when the properties you were researching had ownership structures that existed entirely outside the documentation you knew how to access. Margaret had spent 15 years protecting Richard from the complexity of international corporate law and family wealth management. His betrayal had eliminated her motivation for continuing that protection, and both he and Victoria were about to discover exactly what they had chosen to challenge when they decided that Margaret Chun was someone who could be safely dismissed and discarded. The first indication that Richard's understanding of his financial position was fundamentally incorrect arrived at his office at 9:15 on Thursday morning, delivered by a courier service that specialized in high-priority legal documents. Richard's secretary, Janet Morrison, brought the sealed envelope to his desk with the apologetic efficiency of someone who recognized the gravity of formal legal correspondence. Richard opened the envelope while reviewing quarterly projections, expecting routine contract modifications or partnership amendments that required his signature. Instead, he found himself staring at documents that made no immediate sense, legal language that seemed to describe ownership structures and asset transfers that had no relation to his business. The letterhead belonged to Whitman, Sterling and Associates, one of Boston's most prestigious law firms, known for handling complex corporate disputes and high-net-worth divorces. Richard had never heard of the firm, but the formal language and detailed asset listings suggested this was connected to his divorce proceedings with Margaret. What confused Richard was the systematic listing of properties and business ventures that the documents claimed were owned by entities he had never heard of, with ownership traced back to something called the Chun International Holdings Trust. The properties listed included his own office building, the Beacon Hill Mansion, and the financial district acquisitions that represented his most successful investments. Richard reached for his phone to call his attorney, David Carlson, a competent lawyer who had handled Richard's business formation and contract negotiations for the past 8 years. Carlson's secretary informed him that David was in court but would return his call within the hour. While Richard waited, he reread the documents with growing confusion and irritation. The legal language was complex, but the basic claim seemed to be that Margaret had some form of legal interest in assets that Richard had always considered his personal property. The suggestion was absurd, but the formal presentation and detailed documentation demanded serious attention. David Carlson returned Richard's call at 10:45, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of a lawyer who had already received similar documentation and was struggling to understand its implications. "Richard," David said, "I need to ask you some questions about the funding sources for your business ventures, particularly the early investment capital that allowed you to expand beyond your original accounting practice." Richard's irritation was evident in his voice. "What do you mean funding sources, David? I built this business through my own expertise and strategic vision. Any loans or partnerships were standard business arrangements." David's pause was long enough to create tension before he continued. "Richard, I've been contacted by representatives of Whitman, Sterling and Associates regarding some documents that suggest your business expansion was funded through international investment structures that were not disclosed in our original corporate filings." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with David asking increasingly specific questions about Margaret's family background, her involvement in business decisions, and the source of funds that had supported Richard's growth over the past 15 years. By the end of the call, Richard was beginning to understand that his simple divorce proceedings had become significantly more complicated. At 11:30, Richard called Victoria Sterling to discuss the unexpected legal complications that threatened to delay their plans. Victoria listened with professional concern as Richard described the confusing documents and his lawyer's puzzling questions about funding sources. "Richard," Victoria said, her voice carrying the authoritative calm of someone accustomed to solving complex problems, "this sounds like Margaret's attempt to complicate the divorce settlement by claiming involvement in business assets. It's actually a fairly common strategy for spouses who feel entitled to more than their fair share." Richard's relief was audible as Victoria provided a rational explanation for the morning's confusion. "Of course, that makes perfect sense. Margaret is trying to create leverage by manufacturing claims about business ownership. David can handle this easily once he understands what we're dealing with." Victoria's confidence was reassuring and absolute. I deal with property disputes all the time, Richard. Documentation can be manipulated to suggest ownership structures that don't actually exist. Margaret probably hired an expensive law firm to create impressive-looking papers that won't hold up under serious legal scrutiny. The conversation ended with Victoria promising to research Whitman, Sterling, and Associates to determine their reputation and tactics in contentious divorce cases. Richard returned to his work with restored confidence, convinced that Margaret's unexpected legal maneuvering was a desperate attempt to claim assets she had never actually controlled. At 1:45, Victoria called Richard back with information that shattered his comfortable assumptions about the morning's events. Her voice was tight with controlled concern as she delivered news that changed everything they thought they understood about their situation. Richard, Victoria said, her professional composure barely concealing growing alarm, I researched Whitman, Sterling, and Associates. They're not a divorce firm. They specialize in international corporate law and complex asset recovery. Their client list includes multinational corporations and foreign governments. Richard's confusion was immediate and total. What does that mean, Victoria? Why would Margaret need lawyers who specialize in international corporate law? Victoria's answer carried the measured precision of someone delivering information that contradicted everything she had previously believed. Richard, I also researched Chin International Holdings. It's not some fabricated entity. It's one of Asia's largest shipping and logistics companies, with annual revenues in the billions. The silence that followed was filled with implications that neither Richard nor Victoria wanted to acknowledge. When Richard finally spoke, his voice carried a new quality of uncertainty that had been absent from his recent conversations. Are you saying that Margaret's family is connected to this Chun International Holdings company? Victoria's research had been thorough and professionally executed, but her findings contradicted everything she thought she knew about Richard's quiet housewife. Margaret Chun is not just connected to Chun International Holdings, Richard. According to corporate filings and business publications, she's the designated heir to the company. Her father, Jonathan Chun, founded the business 40 years ago. Richard's response was immediate denial rather than acceptance of information that threatened his entire understanding of his marriage and his success. That's impossible, Victoria. Margaret doesn't know anything about international business. She's never been involved in corporate finance or complex investments. Victoria had continued her research throughout the afternoon, accessing business databases and corporate records that painted a picture of Margaret Chun that bore no resemblance to the woman Richard thought he had married. Richard, Margaret Chun graduated summa cum laude from the London School of Economics. She has advanced degrees in international law and corporate finance. She's listed as a director of multiple Chun International subsidiaries. The conversation continued as Victoria systematically destroyed Richard's assumptions about Margaret's background and capabilities. Each new piece of information was more devastating than the last, revealing a level of sophistication and international business involvement that Richard had never imagined. By 3:30, Richard understood that the legal documents he had received that morning were not Margaret's desperate attempt to complicate their divorce, but the beginning of a systematic revelation about who actually owned the assets he had considered his personal success story. Victoria's voice carried professional defeat as she delivered the final piece of information that completed the picture. Richard, the financial district properties that we've been so proud of acquiring. The funding for those purchases came from an entity called Pacific Investment Holdings, which is wholly owned by Chun International. Margaret Chun personally guaranteed the investment. Richard's office suddenly felt smaller and less substantial as he processed the implications of Victoria's research. The business success he had built his identity around was not the result of his individual expertise, but the product of support and funding from sources he had never acknowledged or even recognized. Victoria's next words carried the professional honesty of someone who had realized her own position was far more precarious than she had understood. Richard, I need to tell you something about my own situation. I've been researching my recent client accounts, and it appears that several of my most successful property transactions have been financed through entities that are ultimately connected to Chun International Holdings. The revelation that Victoria's own business success was inadvertently connected to Margaret's family empire added another layer of complexity to a situation that was already beyond Richard's ability to fully comprehend. The woman they had dismissed as a simple housewife had apparently been the invisible foundation beneath both of their professional achievements. At 4 o'clock, Richard received a second courier delivery, this time containing documents that were even more specific and devastating than the morning's legal notices. The new paperwork included detailed financial records showing the true ownership structure of every business venture and property acquisition that Richard had claimed as personal achievements. The documentation was comprehensive and undeniable, showing a 15-year pattern of investment and support that had been carefully disguised as business loans and partnership arrangements. Margaret had not just been a passive beneficiary of Richard's success, she had been its primary architect and financial foundation. Victoria arrived at Richard's office at 4:30 to review the new documents together. Her professional expertise now focused on understanding exactly how completely they had both misunderstood their positions. As they worked through the complex legal language and financial structures, the scope of Margaret's actual power became increasingly clear. The Beacon Hill mansion was owned entirely by a Chun family trust, with Richard listed as a beneficiary whose occupancy rights could be terminated with appropriate legal notice. His business expansion had been funded through structured loans that gave him operational control but not ownership of the underlying assets. Most devastating of all, the financial district properties that represented Richard's greatest business triumph were owned outright by Margaret personally through inheritance structures that predated their marriage by several years. Victoria's expertise in commercial real estate had completely missed the international corporate ownership that controlled the properties she thought she was helping Richard acquire. By 5 o'clock, Richard and Victoria understood that their confident planning for a shared future had been based on ownership assumptions that were entirely incorrect. The assets they intended to use as the foundation for their new life together belonged to the woman they had planned to discard with minimal financial consideration. Victoria's professional composure finally cracked as she processed the complete reversal of everything she thought she knew about her situation. "Richard," she said, her voice carrying professional defeat, "Margaret doesn't need to negotiate a divorce settlement with you. She needs to decide whether to allow you to continue managing assets that she has always owned." Richard's response was barely audible as he confronted the magnitude of his misunderstanding about the foundation of his success and the nature of his marriage. "What do we do now, Victoria?" Victoria's expertise in complex property transactions provided no guidance for a situation where the person you had planned to financially marginalize turned out to control everything you thought you owned. Before she could formulate an answer, Richard's phone rang with a call that would provide the final piece of information needed to complete their education about the difference between apparent success and actual power. The call was from David Carlson, Richard's attorney, with news that eliminated any remaining hope that the morning's revelations might be somehow manageable or negotiable. "Richard," David said, his voice carrying the professional gravity of someone delivering unavoidable bad news, "I've been contacted by Margaret's legal representation. They've provided documentation proving that she has the legal authority to terminate your business partnerships and call in all outstanding loans immediately." The conversation was brief but comprehensive, with David explaining that Margaret's legal position was so strong that challenging it would be both expensive and futile. The international corporate structures that controlled Richard's business assets were designed by lawyers who specialized in protecting family wealth from exactly the kind of challenges that Richard might attempt. When Richard ended the call, he and Victoria sat in silence for several minutes, processing the complete destruction of their assumptions about power, ownership, and their own positions in a situation they had believed they controlled completely. Victoria finally spoke with the professional honesty of someone whose expertise had proved entirely inadequate for the situation they faced. "Richard, we need to understand that we're not negotiating with a housewife who can be intimidated or financially marginalized. We're dealing with someone who has always held the power to destroy everything we thought we had built." Richard's voice carried the hollow quality of someone whose entire self-concept had been systematically dismantled in the span of a single day. "What does Margaret want from us, Victoria?" Victoria's answer was delivered with the grim certainty of someone who had finally understood the true nature of their situation. "I think Margaret wants us to learn exactly what we chose to challenge when we decided she could be safely dismissed and replaced. As evening approached, Richard and Victoria remained in his office, surrounded by documents that proved beyond dispute that the woman they had confidently planned to marginalize was actually the source of everything they had believed they possessed. Their future together, so carefully planned and confidently anticipated, was entirely dependent on the continued generosity of someone they had betrayed with casual cruelty. Margaret Chun had spent 15 years allowing them to believe in their own narratives of success and expertise. Their affair and their dismissive treatment of her contributions had eliminated her motivation for continuing that protection. Tomorrow, they would begin learning exactly what it meant to challenge someone whose power was real rather than assumed, and whose patience had limits that they had finally exceeded. The Suffolk County Family Court building cast long shadows in the early morning light as Richard Blackwood and Victoria Sterling approached the courthouse steps together, their confident stride from 3 weeks earlier now replaced with the cautious movements of people who had learned to question their assumptions about power and control. Richard wore his most expensive suit, a gesture toward maintaining dignity in circumstances that had systematically stripped away his illusions of success and authority. Victoria walked beside him with professional composure that barely concealed the anxiety that had replaced her earlier triumphant anticipation of claiming Richard's assets as her own. David Carlson met them at the security checkpoint, his expression carrying the grim professionalism of a lawyer who had spent the previous week discovering that his client's case was far more complex and hopeless than anyone had initially understood. His usual confident demeanor had been replaced with the careful neutrality of someone preparing to manage a legal disaster. "Richard," David said quietly as they moved through the courthouse corridors, "I need to prepare you for what we're likely to encounter today. Margaret's legal team has provided additional documentation that significantly strengthens her position regarding asset ownership and business control." Victoria's voice carried professional concern tinged with personal desperation. "David, surely there must be some avenue for challenging ownership claims that were never disclosed during the marriage." Richard had no knowledge of these international corporate structures. David's response was delivered with the careful precision of someone who had spent considerable time researching options that simply did not exist. "Victoria, the documentation proves that Margaret's family investment in Richard's business ventures was structured through legitimate international corporate entities. Richard's lack of awareness about the funding sources doesn't alter the legal reality of who actually owns what." They entered Courtroom 7, a formal space designed to emphasize the gravity of legal proceedings. The mahogany panels and traditional furnishings created an atmosphere of institutional authority that made Richard acutely aware of how completely his situation had deteriorated since his confident affair with Victoria had begun. Margaret was already seated at the plaintiff's table, accompanied by 3 attorneys whose expensive suits and quiet confidence suggested resources that dwarfed anything Richard could access. She looked composed and dignified, wearing a simple navy dress that Richard now realized probably cost more than he had ever imagined, chosen from designers whose names he had never heard. What struck Richard most powerfully was the transformation in Margaret's demeanor. Gone was the submissive housewife who had served coffee and accepted condescending dismissals with quiet grace. In her place sat a woman whose bearing suggested authority and sophistication that Richard was only now beginning to recognize. The lead attorney for Margaret's team was Harrison Way, a partner at Whitman, Sterling and Associates whose reputation for handling complex international asset disputes had made him legendary in corporate legal circles. His presence alone suggested that Margaret's resources extended far beyond what Richard had ever comprehended. Judge Patricia Morrison entered the courtroom with the measured dignity of someone who had presided over countless divorce proceedings, but her expression suggested that today's case was more complex than the usual division of marital assets. The preliminary documentation had clearly indicated that this would involve international corporate law and sophisticated financial structures. "Your Honor," Harrison Way began, his voice carrying the authoritative calm of someone presenting information rather than making arguments, "we appreciate the court's attention to this matter, which involves the clarification of asset ownership that has been obscured by complex international corporate structures." Richard's attorney, David Carlson, rose to present his client's position with the professional competence of someone who knew his case was fundamentally weak but was obligated to provide adequate representation. Your Honor, David said, my client Richard Blackwood seeks a standard divorce settlement based on the marital assets that were accumulated during 15 years of marriage through his business expertise and investment decisions. Judge Morrison reviewed the preliminary documents with the careful attention of someone who understood that the morning's proceedings would involve far more complexity than David Carlson's simple request suggested. Mr. Way, Judge Morrison said, I understand that your client has provided extensive documentation regarding the ownership structure of assets that Mr. Blackwood considers marital property. Please proceed with your presentation. Harrison Way approached the bench with a leather portfolio that contained documents organized with meticulous precision. Your Honor, we have prepared a comprehensive presentation that will clarify the true ownership of all assets that Mr. Blackwood has claimed as personal property. The first document that Way presented was a corporate charter for Chun International Holdings, showing Margaret Chun as the designated heir and primary beneficiary of a multinational corporation with assets exceeding $8 billion. The revelation sent a visible shock through Richard's legal team and caused Victoria to grip the wooden railing with white-knuckled tension. Judge Morrison examined the corporate documents with professional thoroughness before addressing the courtroom. Mrs. Chun, I see that you are listed as the primary stakeholder in a significant international corporation. Can you explain how this relates to the assets in question in your divorce proceedings? Margaret rose to address the court with quiet dignity, her voice carrying the confident authority of someone who had finally stopped concealing her true capabilities and background. Your Honor, Margaret said, her words clear and precisely articulated, during my marriage to Mr. Blackwood, my family provided financial support for his business ventures through carefully structured corporate investments. These investments were designed to allow Mr. Blackwood to maintain operational control while preserving my family's ownership of the underlying assets. Harrison Way continued the presentation by producing property deeds that showed the true ownership structure of every asset that Richard had considered his personal success. The Beacon Hill mansion was owned entirely by a Chun family trust. The office building that housed Richard's business was owned by Pacific Investment Holdings, a wholly owned subsidiary of Chun International. The financial district properties that represented Richard's greatest achievement were owned outright by Margaret through inheritance structures that predated her marriage. David Carlson attempted to challenge the documentation with questions about disclosure requirements and marital property law, but each objection was systematically dismantled by evidence that proved Margaret's family had funded Richard's success through legitimate international business structures. Victoria Sterling sat in the gallery watching her carefully planned future disintegrate as each document was presented to the court. The properties she had researched and the business success she had admired were revealed to belong entirely to the woman she had dismissed as an ignorant housewife. The most devastating revelation came when Harrison Way produced loan documents showing that Richard's business expansion had been entirely funded through structured financing from Hong Kong-based institutions that were ultimately controlled by the Chun family. Richard had never owned the assets he believed represented his personal achievements. Your Honor, Way said, presenting the final set of documents with professional precision, we have here the original loan agreements that funded Mr. Blackwood's business ventures, along with the corporate governance documents that establish Mrs. Chin's authority to call these loans and terminate Mr. Blackwood's management agreements at any time. Judge Morrison reviewed the loan documentation with growing understanding of the true nature of Richard's financial position. Mr. Blackwood, she said, addressing Richard directly, were you aware that your business expansion was funded through loans from international entities controlled by your wife's family? Richard's response was barely audible as he confronted the complete destruction of his self-made success narrative. No, Your Honor. I believed I had secured standard business financing through conventional channels. Harrison Way approached the bench with additional documents that completed the picture of Richard's financial dependency. Your Honor, we have prepared a comprehensive accounting of all funds provided to support Mr. Blackwood's ventures over the past 15 years. The total investment from Chun family entities exceeds $47 million. The figure hung in the courtroom air like a physical presence, and Victoria Sterling visibly paled as she understood that her research into Richard's wealth had missed the most fundamental fact about its source and ownership. Judge Morrison addressed Margaret directly with recognition of the extraordinary nature of the case before her. Mrs. Chun, given the documentation presented, it appears that you have been providing substantial financial support for your husband's business activities throughout your marriage. What arrangement are you seeking for the dissolution of this marriage? Margaret's response was delivered with the quiet authority of someone who had spent weeks preparing for exactly this moment. Your Honor, I seek only the return of assets that have always belonged to my family, and the termination of Mr. Blackwood's management authority over properties and businesses that he has never actually owned. Harrison Way presented the final document that would complete Richard and Victoria's education about the consequences of their confident dismissal of Margaret's value and intelligence. Your Honor, Mrs. Chun is prepared to offer Mr. Blackwood a settlement of $500,000 and the opportunity to maintain employment with Chun International's Boston office, contingent upon his acceptance of the true ownership structure of all assets involved. Richard's shock at the conditional employment offer was visible throughout the courtroom. The man who had planned to discard Margaret with minimal alimony was being offered continued work by the woman whose family had always controlled everything he thought he owned. David Carlson attempted a final challenge to the settlement terms, but Judge Morrison's examination of the documentation had convinced her that Margaret's legal position was absolutely unassailable. Mr. Carlson, she said, your client appears to have been managing assets belonging to his wife's family without understanding their true ownership. Mrs. Chin's offer seems remarkably generous under these circumstances. Victoria Sterling rose from her seat in the gallery and approached Richard with the desperate urgency of someone whose own future had just evaporated. She whispered urgently in his ear, but her words carried clearly enough for the courtroom to hear her panic about her own business arrangements and property acquisitions. Judge Morrison addressed the courtroom with final authority. Based on the documentation presented, it is clear that Mrs. Chun has established legitimate ownership of all assets in question. Mr. Blackwood's management of these assets does not constitute ownership, and Mrs. Chin's settlement offer represents extraordinary generosity given the circumstances. The gavel came down with finality that reverberated through Richard's understanding of his own life and achievements. Everything he had built his identity around belonged to the woman he had betrayed, and his future was entirely dependent on her continued willingness to employ him in businesses he had never actually owned. As the courtroom began to empty, Margaret approached Richard and Victoria with the composed dignity of someone whose victory was complete but not vindictive. Richard, she said quietly, her voice carrying neither anger nor satisfaction, I hope this experience has taught you the value of understanding exactly what you possess before you decide to discard it. Victoria Sterling's response was barely coherent, a mixture of professional desperation and personal humiliation as she confronted the complete destruction of her plans and her understanding of her own position. Richard's final words to Margaret carried the hollow defeat of someone whose entire self-concept had been systematically demolished. Margaret, I never knew. I never understood. Margaret's reply was delivered with gentle firmness that somehow made it more devastating than anger could have achieved. Richard, you never asked. You simply assumed that what you saw was all there was to see. As Margaret left the courtroom accompanied by her legal team, Richard and Victoria remained behind, surrounded by the wreckage of their assumptions and the consequences of their casual cruelty towards someone whose power they had never bothered to recognize or respect. The woman they had dismissed as an ignorant housewife had systematically educated them about the difference between apparent control and actual ownership, between confidence and competence, and between the illusion of success and the reality of dependence on forces they had never understood. 6 months after the courtroom revelation that had dismantled Richard Blackwood's understanding of his own success, Margaret Chin stood behind the mahogany desk in what had once been Richard's home office, now transformed into the Boston headquarters of Chun International Holdings' Western Division. The transformation was subtle but complete. Where Richard's personal achievements had once been displayed, Margaret had installed screens showing real-time shipping data from ports across the Pacific. The leather chairs that had hosted his business meetings now accommodated executives from Hong Kong, Singapore, and Los Angeles who arrived weekly to coordinate operations that spanned 3 continents. Margaret wore a charcoal business suit tailored in Hong Kong that emphasized her authority without ostentation. Her bearing carried the confident competence of someone who had finally stopped concealing her capabilities and had embraced the leadership role she had been trained for since childhood. The intercom on her desk buzzed softly, and her assistant's voice announced the arrival of her 10 o'clock appointment. Margaret rose from her chair with the composed efficiency of someone whose schedule was measured in international time zones rather than domestic obligations. Her visitor was Dr. Sarah Martinez, the director of the Women's Financial Independence Foundation, a nonprofit organization that Margaret had funded to provide business education and startup capital for women whose potential had been overlooked or dismissed by traditional financial institutions. "Sarah," Margaret said, extending her hand in greeting, "I'm so pleased you could join me to discuss the Foundation's progress and our expansion plans for the coming year." Dr. Martinez settled into one of the leather chairs with the enthusiastic energy of someone who had discovered that Margaret's support extended far beyond simple charitable donations to genuine partnership in creating systemic change. "Margaret, the results from our first year have exceeded every projection we established. The business education programs have enrolled over 300 women, and our startup funding has launched 47 new enterprises with a success rate that rivals anything in the traditional venture capital world." Margaret reviewed the detailed reports that Dr. Martinez had prepared, noting with satisfaction that the Foundation's work was providing exactly the kind of opportunities that she wished had been available to women who found themselves in situations similar to her own experience with Richard. "What particularly pleases me," Margaret said, "is the diversity of businesses that our funding has supported. From technology consulting to international trade, these women are demonstrating exactly the kind of entrepreneurial vision that traditional investors have consistently overlooked." The conversation continued for an hour, with Margaret and Dr. Martinez planning expansion into additional cities and discussing the establishment of an international mentorship program that would connect successful businesswomen across different countries and industries. As Dr. Martinez prepared to leave, she paused at the door with the expression of someone who had witnessed Margaret's transformation over the past months and understood its broader significance. "Margaret," she said, "the women in our programs often ask about your own experience, particularly how you maintained your confidence and strategic thinking during years when your capabilities were being systematically overlooked. Your story has become quite inspirational." Margaret's response was thoughtful and measured, reflecting the wisdom that had emerged from her experience with Richard and Victoria. "Dr. Martinez, I tell them that true power is never dependent on other people's recognition or acknowledgement. Competence and preparation create opportunities that confidence alone cannot achieve." After Dr. Martinez departed, Margaret returned to her desk to review reports from the various business ventures that now operated under her direct authority rather than Richard's assumed control. The financial district properties were generating exceptional returns, managed by a team of professionals who understood international markets and corporate strategy. Her phone buzzed with an incoming call from Harrison Way, her primary attorney, who had become not just her legal advisor, but a trusted counselor on the complex business decisions that characterized her expanded role in the Chin family empire. "Margaret," Harrison said, his voice carrying satisfaction at business well executed, "I have updates on both Richard Blackwood and Victoria Sterling that I thought you should hear." Margaret leaned back in her chair with the composed attention of someone who remained interested in the consequences of decisions made months earlier but was no longer emotionally invested in their specific outcomes. "Richard has accepted the employment position with Chun International's property management division," Harrison continued. "His performance has been adequate, and he seems to have developed a more realistic understanding of his own capabilities and limitations." The news was neither surprising nor particularly satisfying to Margaret, who had offered Richard continued employment as a practical business decision rather than an act of vindictive generosity. His skills at property management were genuinely useful, and his humble perspective had eliminated the arrogance that had made him insufferable as a husband. "And Victoria Sterling?" Margaret asked, maintaining professional interest in someone whose research skills had been impressive even though her moral judgment had proved catastrophic. Harrison's response carried a note of irony that reflected the complete reversal of Victoria's circumstances. Victoria has been struggling significantly in the real estate market. Her association with the Blackwood divorce case damaged her reputation with high-end clients, and her previous business relationships were more dependent on Richard's apparent wealth than she realized. Margaret considered this information with the analytical detachment of someone who understood that Victoria's situation was entirely the result of her own choices and assumptions. Victoria Sterling had possessed genuine expertise in commercial real estate, but she had applied that expertise to pursuing someone else's wealth rather than building her own independent success. Harrison, Margaret said, has Victoria Sterling approached us about potential business opportunities with Chun International's real estate division. There was a brief pause before Harrison responded with the careful neutrality of someone delivering information that might surprise his client. Actually, yes. Victoria submitted a proposal last week for consulting on Chun International's West Coast property acquisitions. Her research was thorough and professionally executed. Margaret's response was immediate and decisive, reflecting business judgment that was separate from personal history. Schedule a meeting with Victoria for next week. Her expertise in commercial real estate could be valuable for our expansion plans, and people can learn from their mistakes if they're given appropriate opportunities. The decision to consider Victoria Sterling for legitimate business involvement was not driven by forgiveness or personal reconciliation, but by Margaret's understanding that competent professionals were valuable regardless of their previous poor judgment about personal relationships. After ending her conversation with Harrison Way, Margaret spent the afternoon reviewing expansion plans that would establish Chun International offices in Seattle, San Francisco, and eventually Denver. The Western Division had grown far beyond what anyone had anticipated, driven by Margaret's vision and her family's resources. At 4 o'clock, Margaret received an unexpected visitor when Richard Blackwood appeared at her office door with the hesitant demeanor of someone seeking permission to enter a space that had once been his domain. "Margaret," Richard said, his voice carrying humility that had replaced his former confident authority, "I wanted to thank you personally for the employment opportunity and to discuss the quarterly reports for the Property Management Division." Margaret gestured toward the chair across from her desk, noting with professional satisfaction that Richard's work had indeed been competent and thorough. His understanding of his actual position had eliminated the entitled attitude that had made their marriage unbearable. "Richard," Margaret said, "your performance over the past 6 months has been excellent. Your reports are detailed and your recommendations have proven valuable for optimizing our property investments." Richard's response carried genuine gratitude rather than the performed appreciation that had characterized their marriage. "Margaret, I need you to know that I understand now how completely I misunderstood everything about our relationship and my own success. The opportunity to continue working in this field is more generous than I deserved." Margaret studied Richard's face with the analytical attention of someone evaluating an employee's sincerity and future potential rather than a former husband's emotional state. "Richard," she said, "your technical skills were never in question. Your primary limitation was assuming that competence in one area meant superiority in all areas." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, focusing entirely on business matters and future projects. Richard had clearly learned to separate his professional contributions from any expectations of personal relationship or special consideration. As Richard prepared to leave, he paused at the door with the expression of someone who had spent months processing the magnitude of his previous misunderstanding. "Margaret," he said quietly, "Victoria asked me to tell you that she would welcome the opportunity to discuss business collaboration if you're willing to consider her professional qualifications separately from her personal judgment." Margaret's response was delivered with the professional neutrality of someone making business decisions based on practical considerations. "Richard, please tell Victoria that we will evaluate her proposal on its professional merits. Personal history is irrelevant to business competence, assuming people have learned appropriate lessons from their experiences." After Richard departed, Margaret returned to her work with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully transformed personal betrayal into professional opportunity and educational experience for everyone involved. As evening approached, Margaret stood at the windows that overlooked Boston Harbor, watching the international shipping that represented the global reach of her family's business empire. The view reminded her that her temporary experiment in domestic life had ended, but her real work was just beginning. Her phone rang with a call from Hong Kong, her father's voice carrying pride and satisfaction at the success of Margaret's transition back to the family business. "Margaret," Jonathan Chin said, "the Western Division's performance has exceeded all projections. Your leadership has proven that your decision to spend years observing American business practices was excellent preparation for this expanded role." Margaret's response carried the quiet confidence of someone who had learned valuable lessons from experience and was applying them to create lasting success. "Father, the years with Richard taught me important things about recognizing people's true capabilities versus their assumptions about themselves. Those lessons are proving invaluable in business decisions." The conversation with her father continued for an hour, covering expansion plans, personnel decisions, and strategic initiatives that would establish Chin International as a dominant force in North American commerce. As Margaret prepared to leave the office that evening, she reflected on the transformation that had brought her from dismissed housewife to respected business executive. The journey had required patience, strategic thinking, and the willingness to educate people about the consequences of their choices. Richard Blackwood had learned that competence required humility and that success built on borrowed resources demanded acknowledgement of its true sources. Victoria Sterling was discovering that professional expertise meant nothing without ethical judgment and personal integrity. Most importantly, Margaret had learned that concealing your capabilities to protect other people's confidence was a luxury that only those with unlimited power could afford, and even then, only when such protection served worthy purposes. The Chin family had not built an international empire by allowing others to mistake kindness for weakness or generosity for obligation. Margaret's temporary role as supportive wife had ended when support became exploitation and partnership became betrayal. What thoughts do you have about second chances and personal transformation? Share in the comments how you think people can truly learn from their mistakes and whether everyone deserves opportunities to demonstrate growth and change. As Margaret locked her office and prepared to drive home to the Beacon Hill mansion that had always belonged to her family, she considered the lessons that had emerged from her experience with Richard and Victoria. True power came not from dominance or revenge, but from the ability to see people clearly, set appropriate boundaries, and create consequences that educated rather than simply punished. Richard Blackwood would continue working for Chin International as long as his performance remained competent and his attitude remained appropriately humble. Victoria Sterling might receive opportunities to contribute her professional expertise if she demonstrated genuine understanding of business ethics and personal responsibility. Margaret Chin had returned to her true role as a leader in international business, equipped with insights about human nature and American business culture that would serve her well in future endeavors. The quiet housewife who had been dismissed and betrayed had never actually existed. In her place stood someone whose power was real, whose preparation was complete, and whose patience had limits that were now clearly understood by everyone who had chosen to test them. Some lessons could only be learned through direct experience of their consequences, and Margaret had provided exactly the education that Richard and Victoria had earned through their choices. The transformation was complete, and the future belonged to those who understood the difference between confidence and competence, between assumption and knowledge, and between the illusion of control and the reality of earned authority.